ela já é mais envelhecida, ela vai, vamos dizer assim, envelhecer na frente da população brasileira. Bom, mas quase terminando aqui, o que nos chama a atenção é, será que o que vai acontecer? Né? Qual será o custo disso? Nós daremos conta? Uma coisa que chama a atenção nos últimos anos é realmente a mudança do perfil do idoso e também a tendência da promoção de saúde. Por exemplo, aqui é uma matéria interessante da revista Forbes, em que fala assim, a idade dos americanos mais ricos em 2003. Então, as maiores fortunas estão aqui principalmente a partir de 65 anos ou mais. Certo? Os homens mais ricos dos Estados Unidos têm mais de 65 anos de idade. E aqui no Brasil, esse ano, a revista Isto É também publicou na sua capa o perfil do idoso, mais ricos, mais saudáveis, mais poderosos. Claro que isso não é toda a população, mas isso é uma tendência, né, das pessoas envelhecerem, mas envelhecerem com saúde. Eu vou mostrar um pouco mais dessa tendência. Essas, né, imagens chamam a atenção e mostram tudo. Então, são vários livros, né, e programas de promoção da saúde. Aqui no Brasil, nós temos essa campanha, O Futuro Promete, Eu Quero Chegar Bem Lá. Né, temos livros sobre envelhecimento ativo, sobre todos os assuntos. Essa é uma nova realidade, uma nova tendência que ela veio para ficar. Né? O próprio IESS, esse ano, teve 2 eventos sobre promoção da saúde. A Agência Nacional de Saúde Suplementar tem programas de promoção à saúde e também o Ministério da Saúde está preocupado com isso. Então, isso é uma tendência, e por que isso é importante? Para mostrar que o idoso que nós temos hoje, ele é diferente. A pessoa, por exemplo, com 60 anos, né, vamos usar o corte oficial, com 60 anos hoje, ela é diferente do idoso de 20, 30 anos atrás. E o idoso, daqui a 20 anos, daqui a 30 anos, será diferente do idoso de hoje. Tá certo? Então, é isso que eu desejo a todos. Muita saúde, muita prosperidade. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado, Dr. Luiz. Na sequência, chamo ao palco o Dr. John Piggott, diretor executivo do Centre of Excellence in Population Aging Research, CIPAR, da Austrália, para darmos início, então, à segunda palestra do dia, Medindo o Impacto do Envelhecimento, a experiência da Austrália com o Intergenerational Report, IGR. Dr. John Piggott, we are very glad to have you here today, all right? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to the organizers, to Guter and to the organizers of this seminar for inviting me all the way from Australia to present to you. I still have to figure out exactly how this works. There we go. So what I was asked to do is to talk about population aging in Australia and to link that with a particular government document that has been produced in Australia over the last 10 years or so, which tries to give a sense of the costs, the fiscal implications of demographic change in the Australian context. Because this happens in the Australian context, it's necessary to say something about Australian policy in relevant areas, and I will do that. I want to talk first of all about demographic context, and in that I am going to go over some of the material which Guter presented to you just now, but it'll be a little bit different, so it might be worth doing, and it's going to be difficult to remove it. And then talk about the economic context. And in the context of the economic context, a very good and simple way of thinking about GDP is to think about the 3 Ps of population, productivity, and participation. And all those are actually quite important, particularly population and participation in the context of demographic change. I'll then talk some about the policy context and then get to fiscal projections and just conclude with with some general observations about how those fiscal projections are undertaken. When I talk about those issues, then I'm not talking really about policy issues. I'm talking more about measurement issues, issues of how you measure the impacts of population aging. So for demography, I'm going to start at the beginning and talk about fertility, then longevity, and then migration. Migration is very important in Australia. It's much less important in Brazil. And from that, I can derive age structure and age dependency. So I've taken fertility and I've broken it down here to fertility across time at different ages. And I think what comes out of this particular graph is how women are postponing childbirth until much later ages. So early on, we see a general trend downward in fertility amongst women. But by the time you get to the age of 30, then women are becoming to have more children than they had previously. So quite a lot of the impact that you observe with fertility decline is around postponement rather than, so you have to be very careful to sort out steady state declines in fertility from declines in fertility which might be associated with postponement of fertility to later in a woman's life cycle. Overall, though, there's no question fertility has declined, and you can see here that the green lines in all these graphs are about Brazil, and the red lines are about Australia, and when other countries are there, they're in grey. So you can see that fertility has declined much more markedly in Brazil than in Australia. Back further, there are as many as 6 children per woman, sort of total fertility rate. It was much lower in Australia 50 years ago, but they've converged to more or less the same. In fact, Australia, to my surprise when I looked at these comparative statistics, has a marginally higher fertility rate than Brazil. The comment I'd make about this is that obviously to the left of the vertical line, we know what's happened, and we have a pretty good idea, I guess, of what's going to happen in the next 10 years, maybe 20 years. But if you go out to 30 years, we're talking about the fertility behavior of people who have yet to be born. And those numbers have to be guesses. We didn't expect in 1930 that there would be a baby boom. We didn't expect in 1950 that the baby boom would end. Right? And there are going to be unpredictable changes, or changes which we can't readily predict in future fertility behavior. So the assumption which is made globally in this context when people talk about population aging, which is made by the UN, and that fertility will stay low, may not in fact eventuate. So the next piece of population aging is longevity, and here I have some statistics for men and women and how longevity at birth is increasing in both Australia and Brazil. Australia, you'll see we live longer in Australia, but by not that much, and Brazil will be catching us up. What I think is important in this context is the change in midlife longevity. So if you look at how much longevity increased between 1950 and 1980, and then you compare that with how much longevity increased between 1980 and the present, actually 2007 in these statistics, but think of it as the present. In that context, longevity at birth increased very substantially in that first period, but longevity at age 50 hardly increased at all. In fact, is this better? Yeah? Shall I turn this off? Longevity increased between 1980 and 2010 at the age of 50, hardly at all. But if you take the more recent period between 1980 and the present time, longevity at age 50 has gone up by a great deal. And we found some statistics for Brazil. We find that it's gone up by 5 years in this more recent period. I can't tell you what happened earlier on. I couldn't find earlier statistics for longevity at 50 in Brazil. But you can see how dramatic that is. And that's very important for policy, because so much of the expenditure side of population aging is about supporting aging people. And if this sudden increase in longevity at late ages is taking place, as it evidently is, that has major implications for fiscal cost, major implications for policy settings in countries where it occurs. I was listening, well, I'll come later. I think Brazil has some distance to go here in terms of the way its health policies are running, and I'll return to that later on. Now, so, I'm sorry, it went the wrong way, I think. There we go. Now let me turn to migration. Migration is actually a very important part of the Australian demographic story. It's much less important in Brazil. I won't dwell on it. But something like 1% of the population of Australia actually occurs through migration every year. So 1% of the population comes in as migrants each year. And those are largely younger people. So on the left-hand side here, we can see the migrant age structure, and you can see most of them are between the age of 15 and 44, and that helps keep Australia young. Migration is a very important part. And not only that, but also those people have more children, and so that also keeps our fertility rate high. Here are some graphs which give the age structure, which derives from what I've been talking about, the three pieces of fertility, longevity, and migration. And what's sometimes called the demographic dividend is very visible here. It's that heavy line which goes up, giving Brazil's proportion of population between the ages of 20 and 64. You can see how that's increasing and is continuing to increase. So you're still in a period where you have this demographic dividend or demographic bonus. That's going to end in the next 15 years, and then you will confront these problems much more acutely than you have to date. So Australia is already past that point. You can see the red line in Australia is already dipping down. And so for us, this is a little bit more urgent than perhaps for you, but it's an important lesson to learn, that you can't really free ride on this demographic dividend. You've got to take advantage of it to construct policies which are sustainable in the longer term and in the light of the changing demographic that you are confronting. So this is finally age dependency, and I know Guta has shown you this already. In comparison with Europe, Europe has a higher age dependency than either Australia or Brazil. Australia there is high, and then Brazil is lower, but you can see how fast the Brazilian story is changing, and it's that speed of change, which was alluded to also by Guta, which I think means that action has to be taken sooner rather than later in developing policy responses to this dynamic. And I think that's an important lesson to take from this kind of seminar and from this kind of statistic. So now I'm going to talk about economic context, and in particular I want to talk about participation and then a little bit about productivity, the two other P's. We've talked about population already. So this is the participation story for women, and you can see, make sure it's for women, yes, for women. You can see that Brazil is sitting there actually quite low. I was a little surprised. Maybe these statistics aren't correct. I thought there would be more female labor force participation. This is between the ages of 55 and 64, so we call this in English mature labor force participation. Whereas Australia, as women have come into the labor force early on in their lives, in the 70s and 80s, they've stayed in the labor force much longer. And so that gradual increase in the Australian mature age labor force participation rate for women really reflects, as much as anything else, just the increase in the number of women who stayed in the labor force after childbirth in the 70s and 80s and 90s. Europe as a whole is lower. The OECD lies between Brazil and Australia. here we have males, and there's a story to this as well. You can see that in most countries, labor force participation in this group for males fell early on, and then started at around the turn of the millennium to increase again. Brazil actually looks very healthy in this respect. You seem to have very high labor force participation amongst males at older age groups. Australia has done a very heavy job of climbing up, but in Australia at least, that overall trend has meant that you lose something like 4 years from the 1970s and gain only 1. So we have a long way to go to get back to where we were 40 years ago. And a lot of this has to do with access to old age transfers of various kinds. So that's an important thing. I know you have early pension access in Brazil, and I think that's something that you will need to address, and I'll be coming to that just in a few minutes. This is productivity, and I don't want to say a great deal about productivity. This is the kind of assumption which is made. It's a very important assumption, but it's a very difficult prediction to make as to how Australia or how any country's productivity will change in the long term into the future. It's primarily driven really by technological opportunity, and that in itself is unpredictable. It has to be in there because it's the third of my 3 Ps. So let me now turn to policy. The 3 important parts of policy when it comes to population aging are pensions and health and aged care. And I will spend a little bit of time on each of those and try and unpick some of the costing implications. So this is the way I think about pension policy generally. I think of a first pillar which is really there for poverty alleviation, and you have a targeted first pillar system, as I understand it, which gives poverty alleviation to older people in Brazil, and I understand very effectively. There is a second pillar which I think of as mandatory or compulsory earnings-related pensions. So this could be a pay-as-you-go pension, and that's what you have in Brazil, something which comes from the public sector. It could also be in the private sector. What's important about it is that it's income replacement. It's not just alleviation from poverty. It's income replacement, and it's compulsory for employees. So if you have those 2 conditions, it fits into this second pillar. And then any further support for retirement incomes comes into a third voluntary pillar. So that's the way I've tried to divide this up. And this is what the story is, as I understand it, in Brazil. Right? In Australia, it looks like this. We have a targeted first pillar, which is, it's more than just poverty alleviation, actually. It's means tested, but I think of it as being affluence tested. It's not just for the poor. So more than half the population get a full pension if they've reached the age of access, and it's only a quarter of the population that don't receive any of this. There's a quarter that receives some, so there's a taper which takes them down. And then for the income replacement piece, that's a flat rate pension, but means tested. When it comes to the income replacement piece, that's all pre-funded in Australia, except for a few particular categories of occupation. And that means that it's a defined contribution plan, something that depends upon contributions plus investment. And it therefore carries no real liability for the public sector. In fact, rather the reverse, because if you have a good accumulation, then your first pillar pension will start to reduce. So that second pillar is an important part of why Australia is in relatively good shape when we compare ourselves with other countries when it comes to the fiscal costs of population aging. And then there is a third pillar there, which is about voluntary and which I won't go into. This gives the idea of pension coverage as it is related to wealth. And you can see countries' wealth, and you can see Australia and the USA up there near the right-hand top corner of the chart. Brazil and Chile kind of halfway down, I guess, and then a large number of countries towards the bottom. So there are many emerging economies, maybe at somewhat lower, earlier stages of development than Brazil, and their pension systems frequently consist of nothing more than a civil service pension, and that's going to be a huge problem in times to come. So that's the kind of relationship you see there. I alluded earlier to pension access age, and what this next chart shows is how long people will live in various countries after the pension access age. Right? So we've assumed 55 for Brazil because you have this rule of seniority, and you can see that both for women and for men, Brazil is actually way up there in terms of the number of years of support that are required after pension access. And Australia is actually relatively low, and that's another reason why our population aging costs are being kept in control. So this seems to me to be a very important part of a policy response. Brazil is much higher in our calculations than the OECD, and higher than most other groups of countries. This is a story about private pension assets, and it's just there as actual US billions of dollars. So we're not talking here about proportions of GDP or proportions of people or anything like that. And once again, pre-funding, which is what, for example, your neighbor Chile has done in a very innovative fashion, is something which pushes this line upward, and is something that's worth thinking about in the pension context. When it comes to what I call decumulation, what happens after retirement,